Okay, we'll move on to item 10, conduct of business. A, receive quarterly financial report as of March 31st, 2009 for the 2008-09 General Fund, Special Revenues Fund, Enterprise Funds, and Capital Improvement Budget. And Mr. O'Leary.
Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, the City Council just spent the past hour and a half at a study session reviewing a recommendation from the City Manager for an outline for the 09-10 budget. What I'd like to do now is to review with the Council where we are with the current 08-09 budget. We're 3/4 of the way through the year, and the problems for the budget for next year. In many ways, the seeds of the problem really came about in 08-09, and the Council has already had to take decisive action budget-wise in the current year that actually is setting the foundation for getting through next year. The economic crisis, sometimes I'm stunned by the fact it seems like the economic crisis has been going on for 4 or 5 years now, but the real impact for the city and much of the financial crisis really percolated and really began during 08-09, and August, September is really perceived as the beginning of the recession, and the impacts have been, as we've discussed, and just briefly review again, in anticipation that property tax revenues, while they will not drop dramatically over a short period of time, that the assessed values are declining, foreclosures are up, and that's going to have an impact on our general fund property tax revenue. Sales tax is an area where we've already experienced downturns in adopting the current year's budget. There was a reduction in sales tax estimate from what we received and what the budget was last year. The Council's already taken action to reduce the budget this year already for sales tax in anticipation of further declines. The city experienced in the current year the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy impact and nearly a $700,000, a little over a $700,000 impact on our general fund in the current year. And finally, after a period of many months of increase and actually sort of a robust period for our TOT and hotel tax, that has leveled off, and we've actually experienced 4 consecutive months now of decline in a month compared to the same month last year. The Council, as I mentioned, through a budget amendment that was approved back in January, has actually reduced anticipated general fund revenues in 3 areas. Sales tax was reduced by $300,000. Our use of money in property, which is really our interest earnings, was reduced by $743,000, and actually our departmental revenue for the Community Development Department for our planning and building fees was actually reduced virtually in half based on the lower business activity that we've been experiencing. So the Council has already taken action, and when you're looking at the performance of the budget so far this year on the next couple of charts that I'm going to be showing, we have already adjusted the budget, the revenue for these amounts that I've just indicated were reflected in an earlier budget amendment. Again, just to remind the Council that there was decisive action taken very quickly this year to resolve the gap between the revenues and expenses, and the city manager proposed and the city council reviewed strategies responding to the economic crisis. Hiring freeze was imposed around mid-year. There was the definitive anticipation of salary savings for additional vacant positions. Contract services were reduced. Supplies and equipment costs were deferred or reduced, and there was a compensation contingency in the current year's budget that was actually eliminated based on the council direction that compensation, employee compensation would not be increased in the current year. And as you know, there's further conversation about employee compensation into the future. There was also, in fact, use of one-time, not reserves, but one-time revenue using pass-through money from the RDA and an ERAF refund in order to balance the budget and to meet the deficit of $1.4 million. So that's the background of the budget that would be looking at. Again, the revenues for general government include primarily, this is all of the taxes are in the general fund. I mentioned property tax. You see that sales tax so far is 64% of the budget. And if you look back at last year, it was actually 64%, but the amount of revenue that we received is lower. The reason the percent stayed the same is that the budget was reduced. As I mentioned, it's been reduced by $600,000, so the math just happened to work out that it was exactly 64% both years, but sales tax revenue is definitely down compared to last year. Again, you see use of money in property while it's at 78%, and again, the benchmark for 3/4 of the year should be 75%. This is again an area where the budget has been reduced by the $743,000, leaving the budget at $1.1 million. Recoveries and well, that was really what I wanted to comment on the general revenues, and would respond to any questions that you have. In departmental revenues, comments on just a couple of lines. You see the fire revenues are at 156%, obviously an awfully high number. That is primarily because of revenues that we receive from the Office of Emergency Services for refund or reimbursement of $260,000 in overtime that the city needed to expend in sending strike force personnel to California wildfires last summer. So that was our obligation, and the OES has an obligation to pay us back. That doesn't go back into the overtime fund or into the overtime line item. It goes back into revenue. So that's $260,000. I checked the balance of the fire revenues. For the most part, that's based on the issuance of permits and inspections, and looking at the revenue there, it is actually up slightly through 3/4 of this year compared to the full year last year. So fire is being aggressive in actually getting that revenue. Yes, Mayor?
I just had a question. If the revenue, the expenses made for overtime and we're being reimbursed for overtime, why isn't the reimbursement going against the overtime? Why isn't it being applied to overtime? Why does it go into general fund? Because then you're not getting a true picture in your financials. You're going to say at the end of the year, we spent, this was the overtime cost. Well, no, it wasn't, because you were reimbursed.
The best answer I have is our auditors don't like us to net it out like that. The auditors have directed us to put it into revenues, and so that's, I mean, the best we're attempting to do is we're showing it as fire revenue and earmarking it as fire revenue, but what you're describing, we would really be netting. We'd have an expense, and then we'd add a revenue to an expense line item, and our auditors have suggested that we not do that.
Through the chair, just to add to that, there was a citizen that asked in regards to overtime hours, certain levels and what have you. And this was something that I don't think the resident received as a footnote, if you want to call it that, that of the overtime hours that were reported, we're talking about $260,000+ of that was for strike force, which was reimbursed back to the city. So really, when you saw those numbers, they weren't all for firefighter overtime within the city of San Bruno. They were also, if I'm not mistaken, they were also for the strike force teams that went out through California and fought fires, which now we're finally getting reimbursed. So I see what the mayor is saying, because honestly, when you look at it, when we're reporting that, really it's skewed of what that person is really gaining in overtime from his or her service here to San Bruno.
I mean, and I guess, you know, the auditors certainly know better than I, because I only had a few college accounting courses, but, you know, if you spend money on advertising and you get a reimbursement on advertising, you apply that reimbursement to advertising, and it nets your advertising expense. And clearly they might not like you to net it, but you've netted it. I mean, you got a reimbursement of $268,000 from the state of California for that overtime expense that basically we're just ignoring, and we're taking in the revenue.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be glad. Our auditors were here last week, and they're going to be back again. I'll gladly pursue it further with them.
Text me when they're there, and I'll come question.
Bring your accounting book under
right.
your arm, and
it's a little tattered, but you know.
I mean, because I will point out on the redevelopment agency, there's the redevelopment agency revenue and expense looks vastly different than it did last year in what I'm reporting to you, and it's for the exact same reason. We were netting revenues when it came to the payment of pass-through to taxing agencies, which seemed very logical to me. But again, our auditors asked us to take it as an expense, and so again, it skews it, and I've capitulated to that request, but that's not to say that it can't be further addressed, and we can look into that and see if we can do it differently.
Through the chair, how does the state know how much to pay you back? Do you invoice the state?
The state is paying us back based on invoices and a calculation that we need to provide to OES with time and everything for all the personnel that are away.
So just to make it clear in my mind, you invoice the state for an expense that we performed on their behalf, and they're reimbursing us based on that invoice.
Correct.
Okay. Then I totally agree with the mayor. Thank you.
That's how you do it in business.
Right.
Yeah, it seems weird.
We would be happy to provide additional
You need to text us all next week when
All
they're
of
here?
us.
We'll come text us all when the
We'll all
auditors
come
are here?
down.
We'll come talk to them?
We would be happy to provide some additional explanation to the city council. The reimbursement that the city receives is for the service that was provided. It's based on the actual time that was spent. It's also based on the mileage according to a formula. We send an apparatus as well. Our people don't go just by themselves. So the reimbursement is based both upon the invoice as well as, I believe, on some formula that the state uses to evaluate the appropriate cost to the agency. So,
but I mean, again, and it doesn't make any difference to dwell on this, but if you're billing them for man hours that you've expended. A portion of that's man hours, and if the whole 268 isn't for man hours and overtime, it shouldn't go to that. Part should go to the general fund, but if you're taking the time to break it down, it would seem that accounting principles say, you know, you expended it and you took it in as income, they should cross and net each other out.
Through the chair.
Councilman O'Connell?
Thank you. I have a question too. On the list that we gave the gentleman who asked for it for the overtime per person and the fire department, was that strike force overtime reflected in the overtime that was listed? Because if that was so, then that also is unbalanced and not a yearly occurrence.
The information request related to compensation paid to our employees, and all of the compensation paid to the employees, no matter if the overtime was for overtime in the city of San Bruno or overtime in mutual aid or in a strike force, it reflected the total compensation paid to an employee.
Okay, so
Well, but that in and of itself creates a problem, okay? You're being asked how much overtime. It's not painting a clear picture. You spent overtime of, let's just use that it was all 268, none of it was apparatus, but you were mandated by the state of California to spend over $250,000 of this community's money outside of the city, and yet when you report to a citizen, we report that we spent it all. And we don't tell them, there's no explanation anywhere, and now there's not going to even be anything in the financials, because the auditors are telling us not to do it that way. It doesn't make sense. You know, it's not a clear picture. I'm sure Mr. Barrialet, with his Freedom of Information Act and his request, wanted to know how much employees were making on overtime. Were they making it here? I think he would understand that 268,000 of it was mandated by the state and was to fight wildfires. Is totally different than how much was spent here. And I think it's real important that if we have to report it that way in the financial statements, that somehow it be footnoted, or we add a page after the auditors leave and say, look, the auditors said do it this way, but here's the real truth. And that the picture be clear to the citizenry.
Through the chair, and I don't want to dwell on it either, but I do want something to change after you speak to the auditor, you text us, or whatever you need to do, because I think it misrepresents, honestly, what that information was that was given out. And not that anybody was trying to, but it doesn't give an accurate picture. As I said, it's skewed, and I think it's important when, in these challenging times, that citizens are asking these questions, that they be given a full, transparent picture so that they know exactly what it is costing and where the money is coming from.
Proceed.
No more. Make yourself more clear. It shall be. The next slide shows expenditures, total expenditures for the general fund through the third quarter at 76%, which again is just slightly above the benchmark of 75. You've already concluded, and I will just reiterate that the fire department expense is at 80%, in part because of the overtime expenditure for the wildland fires. So that is shown there, and we will work towards reflecting that differently. Just moving on to the redevelopment agency, again, this is the significant accounting change that we're experiencing in this current year. And again, this was the new auditors, and they pointed this out to us last year, and we were implementing it this year based on the council comments. May run this by them again. And just very, very briefly, again, what is happening is San Bruno gets 100% of the tax increment that is due for the redevelopment agency, but immediately the redevelopment agency is turning around, and nearly 40% of what we get goes to other taxing agencies. San Bruno Park Elementary District, the high school district, the college district, the mosquito abatement district. There's 11 agencies that share in this. What I have been doing since the agency was formed was I have been reducing those payments have come out of the revenue that we get for tax increment, so that again sort of the true picture of the tax increment is presented. The auditors have requested that I stop doing that I show that as an expense rather than a reduction in revenue. And so that is why the numbers are different for the redevelopment agency.
And I'll give them that one. You can track it as long as you spell it out and you show where the expense was. That's trackable. But just taking the money for overtime and losing it in revenue is exactly what happens. It's just lost. There's no way you could pick up that financial statement and go through and determine that that was an offset on overtime that you were billed. Where you could in redevelopment see that, okay, this is actually all of the revenue received. You actually get a check or a transfer into your account for that amount of money, and here are the monies you expended or by law were required to pay out to these other agencies. I mean, you can follow that. That makes sense. The other one, it's backwards.
Not to dwell on it, but.
Not to dwell on it, though.
The only other comment I was planning on making was really as it relates to the enterprise funds. I'm going to cut it really short now. City manager keeps saying I have to, but no more. Just looking at the enterprise accounts, generally the revenues and expenses are what we would perceive as being on target. Wanted to point out there is a low revenue number on the stormwater enterprise account. That is generally a fund that the revenues are very closely generally matched to the expenditures. There's very little excess capacity in the stormwater fund. It is impacted this year more because it's more visible. All of the enterprise accounts took a hit from the Lehman Brothers interest earnings. The general fund took half of the loss. The other funds took the other half of the loss. So it is visible in the stormwater fund because the overall fund is smaller than the other. So that's an explanation why the stormwater fund appears lower. With that, I'd be glad to answer any questions the council has.
Any questions of staff? Okay. Thank you for your report. Look forward to your conversation.